Appreciate being here tonight. Want to get right into it. By way of introduction, I was a columnist for 9 years for the Journal doing Rhode Island history mostly, and I did the Larchmont one time, and it fascinated me, and it's haunted me ever since. I started doing lectures around the East Bay, where I'm from, in East Providence and Barrington, and it just rolled and rolled. I've been to north of Boston, Cape Cod, Sturbridge, Mass. Invited me in. And that said, people ask me if I do other lectures, and I say, no, I cannot get off the steamship. It's still rolling. I hope to get up to New Hampshire because there's a lot of elements of, this is a New England story and ultimately an American story. So being here on the 119th anniversary of the Larchmont is emotional for me because I realize I am literally on hallowed ground. The people, the events I'll talk about occurred 6 miles from here on this night. So this is Christmas Eve for me. I tell this tale everywhere I go. Your town, Westerly, and more notably Watch Hill, is on my lips all around New England. So I feel like I've come home in a way. So let's get started, shall we? News of America's most horrific sea disaster came to the world through the barking of a dog. It was sunrise on February 12, 1907, and Elam Littlefield, keeper of the North Light on Block Island and owner of the dog, felt his hand fall to his revolver as his eyes popped open. Elam could hear a desperate pounding over the howls of his dog, so racing to the door, Elam then watched a hand, swollen and bloody, slide down his glass, covered in ice. Then opening the door, Elam watched a young boy crawl across his threshold before collapsing. The boy moaned, "More coming, more coming." A few yards away, the lifeboat that once held the boy bobbed in the surf with the tangled collection of frozen bodies, lifeless, yet staring at the sun. Ladies and gentlemen of Westerly, welcome aboard the Larchmont. The year is 1907, the place, Providence, Rhode Island. It's the height of the Industrial Revolution and prosperity reigned. Providence was affluent and adventurous. The riverfront saw dreamers of every stripe entering and leaving the city. Places that captured the imagination of both young and old. Places like Block Island, courtesy of the famous steamship Mount Hope, or even New York City on the luxurious steamship Providence out of the Fall River line. Now, of course, for more budget-minded travelers, cheapskates in other words, the Larchmont out of the Joy line out of Providence was less expensive. For this was the era of the night boats when $1 would take you from Providence to New York overnight. Now, our tale tonight begins in the shadows of superstition. In 1904, 3 years almost to the day before the Larchmont sank, a Joyline steamer from Providence named the Tremont arrived in New York City on a Monday morning, and a kitchen fire caused the ship to burn down where she docked. Now, trapped in the bowels of the ship were circus lions brought in for a show. Now, the world newspaper, as you see, said that firemen were forced to battle maddened beasts in the flames. Now, despite the great graphic, the story was an absolute fabrication. Yes, there were lions aboard, but unfortunately 2 of them suffocated while still in their cages. But 43 people, as in human beings, were rescued by a 23-year-old pilot named George McVeigh of Providence, who risked his life pulling people out of the burning ship. And yes, McVeigh also rescued 1 baby lioness cub from the blaze. The fire catapults McVeigh into the limelight and atop the slide of destiny, where he's about to begin his descent. But first, say goodbye to the kitty and join me on another very important ship called the Cumberland. You see, the Cumberland proudly served the city of Boston. Now, on a foggy day way back in 1902, the Cumberland actually collides with the Admiral Farragut, an ugly freighter hauling fruit out of the Caribbean. And what do we call a Caribbean freighter hauling fruit? Very good. And yes, there were 32,899 bunches of a banana on the Farragut when she rams the Cumberland. So she starts to sink, the Cumberland rather, starts to sink just outside of Boston Harbor in the deep water. So the captain named Allen makes a very daring run back to Boston where he hopes to beach the ship in the shallows. And he makes it. Just barely as 300 terrified people run off the ship. So Eastern, the company that owns the Cumberland, then sells the Cumberland as scrap value because the insurance company declares her a total loss. So within a month, she's repaired by the Joy Line, who purchase her at a bargain price. And she's given a fresh coat of paint and a new name. Anyone care to guess the new name of the Cumberland? The Larchmont. Even though it's bad luck to change the name of a ship, the Cumberland is proudly renamed Larchmont, named after a small posh village outside of the Bronx. And I'm told it's not much going on, though Joan Rivers, the comedian, is from Larchmont. And that's about all that is known about Larchmont in history. So the Larchmont comes to Providence, Rhode Island, and then it begins. Just 3 weeks after being renamed, fire breaks out in her storage hold just off the Bronx. The fire is contained, but 200 people run for their life. The next year, she runs down a schooner named the Melanson outside of Stratford, Connecticut. No injuries, but plenty of damage. And weeks later, she runs aground off Prudence Island, Narragansett Bay, stranding passengers for 4 hours until a tugboat can free her. And then, in 1905, of course, February in 1905, a passenger named John Hott is shot in the head and robbed while sleeping on the Larchmont. Of course, the crime is never solved. So, given its history of collisions with banana boats, murders, and stranding of people, folks everywhere start to call the Larchmont the hoodoo ship, the cursed ship of the Joy Line. But of course, as we all know, there are no such things as curses, right? Meanwhile, Pilot McVeigh continues to impress his corporate betters. In 1906, he's promoted to captain and given his very own ship to command. That's right, the Larchmont, placing our hero front and center on the hoodoo boat. You'll note McVeigh was only 26. And that brings us to the reason you're all here tonight, the fateful night of Monday, February 11th, 1907, 119 years ago from this hour. Nothing is so essential in understanding the Larchmont disaster as the unusual weather that gripped New England that night. The temperature was 2 degrees below zero that night, and the wind was gusting up to 50 miles per hour. Still, the people came. And this is where they boarded the ship. It's a popular cigar bar in Providence today called the Tel Aviv. And notice, cryptically, how much the building has not changed in over a century. And it's through those doors the passengers went through to get their tickets, most never to return. This is the crew of the Larchmont on February 11th. Captain McVeigh sits in the center row, but to his right sits John Anson, age 32, also of Providence. Anson's important. He'll be at the helm of the Larchmont when trouble comes calling. Now, in addition to locals, there were people from all over the world above the Larchmont that evening. Let's meet a few. Harris and Bertha Feldman were returning to their home in New York City. Now, Harris, age 40, was a burly Jewish man whose work with the Fraternal Order of the Eagles, a civic organization, had brought him to Providence. Feldman once served in the Russian Navy and coincidentally, you're going to hear that word a lot tonight, coincidentally survived a winter shipwreck on the Black Sea, just like most people, right? That experience would prove fortuitous for Feldman, so remember the name. The diversity among passengers was striking. It included members of the Eastern Scandinavian Corps of the Salvation Army, better known as the Swedish Salvationists, 8 of whom are pictured here. They were all from cities in Massachusetts, and they were on their way to a big officers' conference in the Big Apple. And we can't forget the truly incredible Millard Franklin. The boy Houdini, he called himself. Millard was a frequent flyer on the Larchmont, and he made a career, get this, out of imitating and challenging at times the great Harry Houdini. Now, Millard would often leave home in North Attleboro unannounced to perform in New York. In fact, his own mother was unaware of Millard being on the Larchmont this night. Now, like his hero, Millard would form death-defying feats, magic, and escape acts. So the question is, was the young escape artist really worthy of the master's name? Or was he just a big dreamer, like most of the crew whispered behind his back? Trust me, we'll find out. Now get ready for her. Yeah. Say hello to Miss Sadie Golub of Boston. Sadie was everything her picture portends, a flamboyant belle from the city. Sadie was on her way to look after her sister in New York City, who had just given birth to a little girl, and the girl was gravely ill. The baby was in trouble. Now, flexing your imagination, what young belle from the movie Titanic might Miss Golub remind us of? Perhaps young Rose. Very good. Now, I'll remind you that in that movie, Rose was a fictitious character. And our Sadie, I assure you, was all too real. And folks, please beware of Larchmont and Titanic comparisons, for they are many in New England. For I assure you, the story you are about to hear will make Titanic look like a Disney cartoon. The Larchmont leaves Providence at 7 p.m. that night. As evening descended upon the city, there were probably over 200 people on the ship, but we'll never know. The passenger list went down with the ship. Upon boarding, many made their way to the saloon or dining area of the ship, where they were entertained by the boy Houdini's well-rehearsed antics and charm. But on this night, Captain McVeigh himself enters the room and announces a sudden change in the entertainment for the evening. The crowd then watched. The young Salvation Army group enters the room. 3 very pretty girls, one passenger remembered. The striking ladies, equipped with an acoustic guitar, then gave an impromptu concert featuring gospel hymns. Passengers listened, one noted, some with great pleasure, others because they had no choice. You know, it speaks to the power of the Salvationist women. These were not the stereotypical bell ringers we might think of today. In those days, the Salvation Army women were top-notch, pedigreed women, and no offense to the boy Houdini, I think it's safe to say the women owned the room that night. So McVeigh then left the room to make his inspections rounds. It was just before 10 p.m. The Larchmont had just passed Jamestown, Rhode Island. Now, meanwhile, the Harry Knowlton, a 3-masted schooner, was running a heavy load of coal from New Jersey to Everett, Massachusetts. The Knowlton was commanded by Captain Frank Haley of Everett, Massachusetts. Haley was a 58-year-old father of 15 who'd been a captain for over 30 years. Now, the wind was still gusting up to 50 miles an hour, and though the seas were rough, visibility was perfectly clear. Neither ship had any problem seeing the other. So what happened? But the Larchmont was heading west towards New York, the Knowlton east towards the Cape. The 2 ships would meet 3 miles south of Watch Hill. I say that everywhere I go. And sometimes I'll stop if I'm having a bad night and say, do you all people in Abington, Mass. know why Watch Hill is so popular? And guess what they'll say? 2 words. So I'm watching out for you, my fellow Rhode Islanders. Now, Quartermaster James Staples was steering the ship. Someone in the audience once said, with his ears, that's Rhode Island. He was taking orders from Pilot Anson. Now, as mentioned, McVeigh was making his inspection rounds. This graph nicely illustrates both captains' official versions of the crash given afterwards to the Globe. The version on top is from Captain McVeigh, which has the Knowlton 2 ship lengths away when she suddenly makes a drastic turn. Below that, Captain Haley's version, perhaps more realistic, simply has 2 unyielding vessels headed for one another. Here's what we know. At 10:20 or so, Captain McVeigh returns to the bridge. Pilot Anson stood at the center window. McVeigh then heads to his cabin to tend to paperwork, very typical. And that's when Anson first saw the lights of the Knowlton. Now, Anson assumed the 2 vessels would pass fairly close, but with enough space in between them, so he didn't budge. However, as the ships drew closer, it was clear they were going to crash. So Anson finally decides to act. For God's sake, Staples, he yells, port the wheel, which meant in those days, taking that big ship's wheel, turning it towards the left, which would steer the boat or the ship towards the right. However, the high winds caused the Larchmont to turn agonizingly slow and push the Knowlton towards the Larchmont at a much faster rate than Anson anticipated. So again, he cries out, port the wheel, and then blows the Larchmont's whistle 4 times, the universal distress signal. Hearing the whistle, McVeigh bolts up to the bridge. Seeing the Knowlton only a few feet off the bow, he famously yells, "My God, John Anson, what have you done?" Anson didn't reply. He just stood there with the binoculars frozen to his face, staring at the Knowlton. Then came the crash. The Knowlton rammed into the port side of the Larchmont just forward of the paddle wheel, causing the Knowlton to T-bone the Larchmont. Most people believe if Anson did nothing and didn't turn at the last minute, the 2 ships would have sideswiped each other with minimal damage. In fact, the 2 ships remained stuck together for a few moments until separated by the waves. So McVeigh instantly thinks of trying to beach the ship in Westerly, Rhode Island. However, the ship's engine was unresponsive. You see, the Knowlton scored a bullseye. It crushed the watertight compartments almost instantly. The Larchmont begins to sink. Even worse, the crash severed the ship's main steam pipe, releasing huge clouds of toxic steam. If that wasn't bad enough, the ship's generator is also knocked out. So passengers found themselves in complete darkness while still in their pajamas. Most had no chance of escaping. So Captain McVeigh orders the crew to report to the lifeboat, but panic takes over. Most of the lifeboats were never touched by a crew member. Even so, McVeigh then orders the lifeboats to be lowered right away. Now, of course, Captain McVeigh's own lifeboat sits just outside of the pilot house. So in he goes. His thinking was, since the clouds of steam prevented him from seeing anything on the ship, he and the crew will have a better chance of finding passengers once their own lifeboats are in the water. It's a fateful decision, and the press does not buy it. In the end, only 4 of the 8 lifeboats survived the sinking. Now, before lowering his own lifeboat, McVeigh inspects the chief engineer's lifeboat, just behind his, full of crew members. No one ever saw that lifeboat again. Witnesses say that just after launching, 3 panicked crew members jumped in the lifeboat, sending it to the bottom of Block Island Sound, where it sits 6 miles away this very night. Once in the water, McVeigh does begin to row toward the port side of the ship where he hopes to find passengers, but his efforts were useless. The wind was just too strong. McVeigh then watched the Larchmont sink on an even keel. She sank in about 15 minutes, maybe less. It was just after 11 p.m. Meanwhile, How do you like that slide, Westerly? The Harry Knowlton, having sustained damage to her bow, was taking on water, so Captain Haley decided to try to beach her at Watch Hill, 3 miles away. But by morning, it was clear she would bottom out off of the shore, so Haley ordered his crew members into a single lifeboat. How many crew members were on the Knowlton? 7. That's all. Fortunately, the lifesavers, your ancestors and neighbors at the Quanaketag Life-Saving Station in nearby Charlestown, were ready to assist, and all 7 members of the Knowlton were saved. Aboard the Larchmont, however, the situation was quite different. Water was flooding the Larchmont at a rate of about 2 feet per minute. It was pitch black, the air filled with poison, as people trampled on one another trying to get out. Some tried to swim their way out. Those that made it out of that particular hell were greeted with the new one, sub-zero weather and 50-mile-an-hour winds, which produced a wind-driven surf that made passengers feel as if a fire hose had been turned on them. The result? Instant frostbite, unimaginable pain, and panic. Said one survivor, the passengers were shouting, weeping, and praying. The men were screaming louder than the women. A woman with a little boy in her arms was pleading to be taken into a lifeboat. She was thrust aside. "My baby," she cried. "If we must die, we'll die together." Snuggling the babe to her breast, she then jumped overboard with this weeping child in her arms. Those that never made it out of the ship fared no better, as the Fall River Globe proclaimed. Many passengers drowned like rats in their cabin as men fought like wild beasts, as this close-up of the painting by Achille Beltrami chillingly demonstrates. Now, Beltrami was a famous 20th century Italian painter and illustrator, and yes, those are knives pictured in the men's hands. Yet even Beltrami, this European master, couldn't quite capture the real horror of the situation. Thus, picture everything you see in this picture covered in ice, including the people. And then you'll get an idea of what it was really like for these poor souls. Now, if there was any upside at all concerning the weather, it was this. During the night, the weather steered the lifeboats and the dead bodies not out into the Atlantic Ocean, but to the northern tip of Block Island called Sandy Point, about 6 miles away. This is an aerial shot of Sandy Point today. You'll notice Keeper Littlefield's lighthouse is still there today. And this is where the bodies and the lifeboats came ashore around dawn on Tuesday morning. Oliver Janvier found his way to one such lifeboat. Several men joined him. "Then I saw a woman floating on a piece of wreckage," he said. "I wanted to help her out, but the other fellows in the boat got scared and took the oars away. She kept screaming, but the men wouldn't save her. They let her drown." Eventually, all 10 men in the boat with Oliver froze to death. One, a barber by trade, took out a straight razor and slit his throat ear to ear. Now, around dawn, Oliver shoves an oar under his arm and collapsed on it, hoping it would steer the boat to Block Island, and it did. He was barely alive when they found him. Fred Heigersel's story was similar to Oliver's. Fred was a 16-year-old German boy who, according to the journal, was unusually bright for a lad of that nationality. He jumped into a lifeboat with 10 other men, sensing a pattern here, ladies. One by one, though, Fred watched them all freeze to death. When his lifeboat approached Sandy Point, he decides to jump in the water. "Oh, I can swim good," he said, "and I couldn't stand all those dead men staring at me any longer." Fred swam for a few minutes when, coincidentally, a huge wave washes him up on Sandy Point. And yes, Fred was the one banging on Keeper Littlefield's door at the start of our story. Meanwhile, Captain McVeigh's lifeboat comes ashore on Sandy Point with 7 crew members and 1 dead passenger, a Russian man who had taken his own life with a knife. Upon being rescued, the frozen crew members, unable to walk, were carried to the lifeguard station. Of course, like Purser Oscar Young here, they all had their outer coats on, which likely kept them all from freezing to death. Giuseppe Filati was in a lifeboat with 20 people, including several women and his son, Nicola. The journal said, Giuseppe smiled as he displayed his swollen hands, which hadn't burst open like all the others. But his joyfulness disappeared, added the paper, when he described the death of his boy, Nicola. Yes, my boy is dead. I row. I stamp my feet so not to freeze to death. But Nicola lay still in the boat and died 1 hour before we reached the land. Giuseppe was the only survivor in a boat of 20. William Headley's lifeless body was found floating off Block Island wearing a life jacket but with the boat hook protruding from his chest. Headley of Roxbury, Mass. was a steward on the Larchmont, and his death was deemed another suicide. However, it was clear to rescuers that Headley was likely pierced with the boat hook while attempting to jump into one of the lifeboats by a now dead passenger who feared he'd tip the boat over. For this, my friends, is human nature. But not all is bad. The tale of the Swedish Salvationists assisting passengers as the Larchmont sank lives in infamy. Led by Captains Anna Runeberg and Helga Hellgren, the women exhorted their partners not to save themselves, but to attend to the passengers, first by assisting them with life jackets and then directing them to the lifeboats. When the ship begins its final descent, they gather hand in hand at the upper deck, sang hymns, then dropped to their knees as they implored passengers to make peace with God. Unlike the crew of the Larchmont, all 10 of the Salvationists, 7 of which were women, willingly went down with the ship. 7 of them rest 6 miles from us tonight still. And then Monday night, found Tuesday morning. The sinking is headline news all over the world, buttressed by the tide of photojournalism. The Boston papers are all over the story. On Block Island, the grim task of collecting the dead begins. Now remember that in 1907, Henry Ford's Model T was still a year or 2 away from widespread use, and so horse-drawn carriages were the norm on Block Island, and horse-drawn wagons, and horse-drawn carts, and that is why the dead were collected in wagons supplied by the islanders themselves. The victims were frozen solid. Most were covered in up to 7 inches of ice. Can you imagine? Here, the body of a young woman shown in the last picture is added to the cart. She's well dressed. They all were taken here to the Sandy Point, or some of them. It was a life-saving station that once stood behind Keeper Littlefield's lighthouse. Life-saving station acted as a morgue in a hospital where the many dead crowded out the living. Some were taken to the old harbor station at the center of the island. Now, a Joyline steamer named Kentucky arrives at Block Island around noontime on Tuesday to retrieve both the living and the dead. Now, this was especially important, for Block Island had no hospital, and Providence's Rhode Island hospital stood at the ready. However, the Kentucky was forbidden to leave the island. Dr. J.C. Champlin, a local physician, orders the bodies of both the living and the dead to remain on Block Island overnight for examination. It's a harsh decree, but guess what? He sticks to it. The bodies of the living and the dead aren't going anywhere. Of course, papers like the Boston Post depicted lifeboats landing on Sandy Point with gentrified passengers being greeted by a team of lifesavers. The reality was quite different as the postcard I'm going to show you demonstrates. And be forewarned, it's pretty graphic. Now remember, a century ago, postcards were the social media of the day, transmitting hard news, not glad tidings, and that is why someone would place a stamp on these most gruesome images. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, the story of the Larchmont is revolting in its graphic horror, taking us to the very depths of human misery. But what if through the ugliness there came glints of life and whispers of miracles? Consider the Elsie. There is a fishing boat long at sea. She is tired. She is covered in ice. Her men are frostbitten and beyond weary. It is late Tuesday morning, and she is the fishing schooner Elsie, and her job is to retrieve the dead bodies from the water. However, the weather is still so bad and cold that the ship is become icing up, and their mission is dangerous. The Elsie is skippered by Captain John Smith and counts 3 of his sons among her crew. Now, just before 11 a.m., they decide they'd better head home, and one of the boys saw it. One of the Smith boys shouted, "Captain, wreckage ahead! Captain, there's something floating out there!" Now, what the Elsie spotted was a section of the Larchmont called the hurricane deck, essentially a row of 5 cabins on top of the ship, on the top deck, that sprung free as the Larchmont went down. About 30 people gathered on top of this structure, and hypothermia quickly began to kill them. Now, as the Elsie approached the hurricane deck, the Smith boy continues to report what he sees. "Captain, there are frozen bodies stuck on that wreckage. Repeat, dead people ahead." In other words, our job isn't over. We're not going anywhere. But as he approaches the hurricane deck, the Smith boy becomes hysterical. "Captain, Dad, there are people alive and moving on that thing." "That's impossible," cried the others. "You couldn't make it a half hour on that damn thing." But there were people alive and moving on the hurricane deck, thanks to Harris Feldman. As the Larchmont was going down, Feldman, the Russian Navy vet, muscled his way to a lifeboat and then hoisted his considerable wife Bertha into the lifeboat and told her goodbye, he'd see her later. Now, reading her husband's face, she figures it out and jumps back into the water, out of the lifeboat and into the water in a desperate attempt to be with her doomed husband. Coincidentally, a wave washes Bertha back aboard the Larchmont, and soaking wet, the Feldmans somehow make it to the hurricane deck. Now, meanwhile, Sadie Golub, tiny Sadie Golub, she doesn't remember how she made it to the hurricane deck, but somehow from the lower deck she does. And she gets to the hurricane deck, and she, coincidentally, hears Feldman calling to his wife in Hebrew. So Sadie yells, "Save me, I'm a Jewish girl too." Feldman turns to the girl he never met and shouted, "If I am saved, you will be saved. If we die, we'll die together." Hollywood couldn't come up with a better line. Also on the deck was Sam Lacombe, a dashing, handsome 21-year-old from Manchester, New Hampshire. Now Lacombe, get this, had worked as an acrobat in the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Tony Rezakovich was a Polish immigrant living in Central Falls. He'd been in America just 1 month. And David Fox of New Jersey was returning from a Bible conference in Boston. And so he immediately begins to pray out loud when he reaches the hurricane deck. Feldman, in particular, understood the danger they all faced. "I could see strong men toppling over into the sleep that could only mean death," he said. "I realized that unless I adopted heroic measures, I would see my wife perish also. She lay between the bodies of 2 dead men and was drifting into that fatal sleep." That's what happens when you die of hypothermia. You go to sleep and you never wake up. "And so," said Feldman, "with the last vestige of strength I had left in me, I began to beat her to revive her flagging life. I struck her on the face and on the body and spared not the blows. For 10 minutes, I continued the drubbing, and to my joy, she opened her eyes and was able to sit up in my arms. The violence of my efforts served the double purpose of reviving my spirit. So Feldman went to work on the others. Keep moving, he commanded. Don't lie down with the dead. Strike one another hard when necessary. Harris directed young Sam Lacombe, the acrobat, to revive Sadie Golub, who had fallen asleep, and told him to watch over her. He insisted David Fox keep on praying out loud, crying. Hearing Fox praying the Psalms of the Old Testament, Feldman says, "Fox, are you Jewish?" "Sir, no, sir, I'm from New Jersey," he replied. Feldman was in complete control and seemed to possess superhuman powers. And all those who listened stayed alive throughout the entire night. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, Feldman, still alive, finally sees the shore of Block Island in the distance, so he strips a shirt off a dead passenger and starts waving it frantically at dawn, to no avail. Unlike the lifeboats, the hurricane deck drifts right past Sandy Point and out to the Atlantic Ocean. All hope is lost. Then around 11 a.m., 12 hours after the Larchmont sank, the 8 survivors see the Elsie breaking through the fog, and all hope is returned. Everything is new again. And against long odds and also 20-foot waves, the Elsie launches 2 small fishing dories like the one pictured here and manages to pull the survivors from the deck. Crew members wondered how any of them could be alive. They are then boarded aboard the Elsie and bundled up, and the Elsie, with Old Glory flying, delivers them to Block Island. But, like the ice-covered ship, the survivors were in very rough shape. Sadie Golub's teeth, for example, were set together so firmly it was 3 hours before they could be pried apart. But they were alive. Consider, this weather caused hardened men to slit their own throats, murder others, and watch women drown. Yet 8 people on a large piece of wood in the open ocean stayed alive for over 12 hours. Miracle? Would have been a miracle to stay alive for 1 hour in those conditions. Now, back on the island, the surfmen convinced Dr. Champlin to allow the survivors to be transported from the Sandy Point life-saving station to the Kentucky to make use of her warm beds for their mandatory overnight stay. Now, the Kentucky is anchored only 50 yards or so off Sandy Point. So the surfmen, basically the precursors of our Coast Guard's men and women, they bundle up the 19 survivors and they load them into the carriage which will take them to the longboat to shuttle them out to the Kentucky. Here the survivors are loaded into the longboat for the short trip out to the Kentucky, and the Globe features a photo of Captain McVeigh himself as among those hoisted aboard the Kentucky. The Globe tells its readers to, quote, note the condition of his frostbitten hands, still appearing to be gripping the oars that he could not use. In this image, the rest of the survivors are hoisted onto the Kentucky. They're bedded down for the night but are denied the comfort of sleep as their bodies start to defrost, causing them to toss and sob throughout the entire night. And that brings us to Wednesday, the second day after the collision, the 13th. And we're in the home stretch of the presentation, so it's time for a little audience participation, Westerly. Would you do me a favor? On the count of 3, would you all be good enough to read out loud the line below the title? 1, 2, 3. Give it to me. Say it again, Westerly. Yes, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to say it. And I want you to repeat that line out loud again. Fair enough? All right, great. Let's move on. At 3 in the afternoon on Wednesday, Dr. Champlin finally releases the Kentucky and allows her to steam to Providence. A photographer actually snaps the Feldmans in a stateroom aboard the Kentucky. And you can see Harris's hands are very swollen with frostbite. Ignoring optics, Captain McVeigh is the first to leave the ship. He can walk. It arrives around Providence at 7 p.m., right where the fish company is today, if you know that popular night spot. His wife waits in a carriage to take him home because he lives in Providence. The rest of the survivors weren't so lucky. They're loaded into carriages and taken to Rhode Island Hospital, where they will be treated for severe frostbite. Finally, the dead are removed. A few found coffins on Block Island, as you can see in the foreground of the photo on the left. But because they were still frozen, most of the dead were hoisted off the ship with the ship's freight crane. Can you imagine? They all were then transported by carriage just a few blocks away to the Thomas Monahan Mortuary on Wickenden Street. Now, this may look familiar to some of you familiar with the East Side. It's a popular coffee shop near Brown University. And although the structure is unchanged from its days of his funeral home, and I've yet to go in there and order a cappuccino with a shot of formaldehyde, but I'm going to do it. Now, you'll notice, fascinating, to the left of the coffee exchange, there's still today an empty lot. And that empty lot, that is where the carriage house once stood. What is the carriage house? Well, that would be the garage for all the hearses of the mortuary were kept. And it was in this room, by lantern light, the dead bodies were laid out for identification. This illustration from the Daily Item of Lynn, Mass. Captures the haunting mood at Monahan's, where, quote, 49 stiffened forms, twisted into many curious shapes, rested on empty casket cases with the ghastly expressions of utter terror frozen on their faces. End quote. Family members wept as they identified their dead in a mostly solemn way. However, things did get out of hand when a woman starts screaming and jumps on one of the bodies. It takes several men to remove her from the corpse. "Don't tear me away from my darling," she cries. "Please don't tear me away." She was the mother of Millard Franklin, the boy Houdini. A few days later, hundreds attend his funeral in North Attleboro as news of his death is transmitted everywhere. And in New York City, Henry Wheats, a.k.a. Harry Houdini, then wires funds to the Franklin family to cover the entire expense of burying Millard and then some. So say it. Yes, Millard was a month or two away from a contract and national stardom when the Larchmont came calling. He's buried in North Attleboro. Sam Lacombe, the acrobat from New Hampshire, shocked the physicians when he arrives at Rhode Island Hospital. You see, when awakened by the crash, water was already filling Sam's cabin, so he had to bolt immediately. He makes it to the hurricane death, and the others were stunned to see a man in his underwear and barefoot. He didn't have time to dress. When examined at Rhode Island Hospital, one doctor simply gasped, "Impossible." Sam's arms and legs were completely frozen. Even his back was frozen solid. Death should have come to Lacombe within a half hour of reaching the hurricane deck in that condition, but he pressed on throughout the night. At least 3 times during the night, he pulled Sadie Golub from the water as rogue waves threatened to sweep her away, soaking him again and again, but he never leaves her side. The photo you see here shows Sam just after he boards the Kentucky and just before he would lose consciousness due to the trauma of his body defrosting. Sam lingered for nearly 2 days before dying at Rhode Island Hospital on Thursday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. The journal honors him by describing him as an unconquerable soul, citing the famous poem by Henley. A few days later, leaders of the Salvation Army in England arranged for the funeral of 3 of the 10 Swedish Salvation lost in the disaster. Now, expecting several hundred people, they secure Carnegie Hall in New York City. An hour before the funeral, police are called, however, as over 1,000 people are waiting outside. But by the time the service begins, there are over 5,000 people inside Carnegie Hall and another 10,000 people waiting outside. Still the largest crowd ever to assemble there. British Salvation Army Commander Ava Booth eulogized the Salvationists and recounted how they sang Rock of Ages and Nearer My God to Thee as the ship sank, and in so doing would inspire all of England, including 8 musicians who followed their very example by reprising Nearer My God to Thee when the doomed ship they were on, called Titanic, sank just 5 years later. So Rhode Islanders, please stop calling the Larchmont Rhode Island's Titanic. We have it backwards. Titanic was Europe's Larchmont. This is a memorial to them in New York State, and that's probably Westerly granite, right? In the end, there were only 18 survivors, 10 of which were crew members. The investigation found the Larchmont negligent in the crash, and in particular, pilot John Anson, as longtime maritime laws require steamships to yield the right-of-way to sailing ships. And that's why Captain Haley of the Knowlton never thought of turning. He knew, as all captains did, that it was the steamship's job to get the hell out of the way. Anson went down with the ship. After the disaster, all ships were required to keep passenger lists separate from the vessel. Captain McVeigh was found to be, get this, neither commendable nor censurable for his actions on the Larchmont. But the press eviscerated him, particularly the Boston press, nearly to the point of suicide. Sadie Golub survived and eventually married and made her home in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She died in 1955 and is buried in New York. Her headstone proudly reads, "Last survivor of the Larchmont shipwreck," and features a striking etching of Sadie on the hurricane deck, albeit alone. It's the closest thing we have to a Larchmont memorial. Coincidentally, the baby Sadie was on her way to look after, her newborn niece, died at the very hour the Larchmont sank. The press was stunned to find Harris Feldman conversing freely with all the survivors just one day after being rescued. The Globe called him, quote, "a splendid specimen of substantial manhood," end quote. Isn't that great? I'd love that on my tombstone, but I don't think it's going to happen. The governor of Rhode Island presented Feldman with the Silver Medal of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. He went on to live in Chicago, where his great-grandchildren still remember his exploits. Now, the crew of Captain Smith Elsie was presented the Carnegie Gold Medal of Heroism by the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, a big deal in the day. Still remembered on Block Island with great pride, by the way. Sam Lacombe posthumously receives the Silver Medal from the U.S. Life-Saving Service. We're wrapping up, but I need to know, are you still with me? Yes. Very good, Westerly. This slide's important, even though it's about Pawtucket. 18 years after the disaster, in August of 1925, the steamship Mackinac out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, was carrying 700 people to an outing in Newport for the employees of the J.P. Coates Company. As the Mackinac left Newport on that beautiful day, her boiler exploded, releasing a cloud of toxic steam. Sound familiar? 55 people were scorched to death, including little children. One 10-year-old girl memorably held up her arms and pleaded, "Somebody please blow on them, for they hurt me so." Resting in the captain's quarters at the time of the blast was 45-year-old Captain George McBay of Providence, Rhode Island. Although found not responsible for a faulty boiler repair that caused the Mackinac to explode, although not at the helm of the Larchmont when it smashed into the Knowlton, and although he had nothing to do with the fire that killed the circus lions, nevertheless, McVeigh was forbidden to again skipper a ship containing passengers. Thus it appears superstition weighed heavily in his sentencing. The captain died in 1951. If you go on a cruise and you walk in the gangway and they say hello to Captain McVeigh, think twice. Now, would you like to see where the Larchmont sits today? In 1964, a diver discovered the Larchmont, a.k.a. the Cumberland, 3 miles off the coast of, yes, and 130 feet below the surface. These pictures were taken 15 years ago. You'll notice the ship's boilers and paddle wheels were still visible at the time, although I'm told fishing nets are slowly destroying what's left of her. They also eventually discovered that the infamous hurricane deck was being used as a sheepfold by a thrifty Block Islander, as any good resident of Westerly would do, I'm sure. The last slide I'm going to show you tonight shows how most of these slides appear when you find them in microfilm, and fittingly places our tale back in the treasure chest of time. Dickens once wrote, "And then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. Such was the case for many on the Larchmont that evening. But others, a precious few, did indeed observe the glittering sons and daughters of the light shining through both man and nature's darkest hour, and we should remember them well, and it is in their honor that I dedicate this presentation. So, my friends on this hallowed ground of Westerly, this concludes tonight's voyage of the Larchmont. I'm Daniel Harrington.